They say madness is born in silence, but the Ashfords proved it screams, not from padded cells or distant asylums, but from the grand halls of the powerful. This isn't a ghost story. This is blood and legacy, refined over centuries. Madness, institutionalized. The Ashford lineage didn't begin with a monster. It began with ambition, and like all empires, it whispered of purity, of legacy, of something eternal. But deep within that pursuit lay a rot, a lust not just for dominance but for transcendence. They were aristocrats, yes, industrialists, patrons of the crown, but behind closed doors, practitioners of control, not the kind you read in newspapers, the kind governments borrow from, the kind secret societies envy. Their madness was measured, clinical, passed down like inheritance. Edward Ashford, the patriarch, wasn't content to own factories or land. He wanted to own minds, and he nearly succeeded. He believed the soul could be stripped, rewritten, perfected, not by God, but by man. And so began the experiments, hidden beneath the estate, masked as treatment, cloaked in science. Children disappeared, servants vanished, and those who returned weren't the same. But no scandal surfaced, no law intervened. Because when you dine with ministers and bankroll universities, sin becomes innovation. The genesis of madness wasn't an explosion, it was a seed, planted in the fertile soil of unchecked power, watered with blood, nurtured by silence. And the world, it applauded, because we love brilliance, even when it's diseased. Welcome to the Ashfords. Imagine a child raised in a cathedral of control, where love is a calculated variable and affection is weaponized. Alexander Ashford was that child, born not of passion, but of design, a controlled experiment wrapped in velvet and fed lies with silver spoons. He was never allowed to cry, never permitted to fail, every gesture monitored, every word measured. His tutors weren't teachers, they were programmers. And his father, Edward, not a parent, but a god, cold, exacting, infatuated with obedience. But Alexander wasn't a prodigy, he was a prison, built in flesh, crafted to continue the legacy of purity, yet never human enough to escape it. His rebellion wasn't loud, it was quiet. Genius turned inward, obsession turned synthetic. At the age of 15, Alexander vanished from public life. Officially, illness. Privately, he'd become something else, something unnatural. His father's experiments didn't end at the mind. They dove deeper, into blood, memory, identity. And when Edward died mysteriously, Alexander emerged, altered. He walked differently, spoke with a new rhythm. His eyes, hollow, like glass, as if the boy had been erased or replaced. What came next was unspeakable, a secret project buried within Ashford archives, codenamed Veronica, a genetic resurrection, attempting to bring back the Ashford matriarch through cloning, but not out of love, out of ego. He didn't want family, he wanted obedient reflection. The result was Alfred and Alexia, twins created from spliced DNA and unnatural rituals, but they weren't children, they were puppets, his last grasp at godhood, and as they grew, so did the sickness. The twins developed their own psychosis, narcissistic, cruel, brilliant, unstable. It was no longer madness by inheritance, it was madness by design. The line between human and construct blurred. The Ashfords weren't dying, they were mutating, becoming Ava, tars of delusion, a new nobility, not of bloodlines, but of engineered supremacy, and the world still watched in silence. In the deepest wing of Ashford Manor there was a locked chamber, soundproofed, sealed with biometric encryption, and guarded by men who never spoke. Not even the twins, Alfred and Alexia, were allowed inside, but they always listened. At night, when the wind died and the corridors stilled, they could hear it, the breathing, rhythmic, wet, inhuman. This was where Alexander kept his secret, or rather, what was left of him. Because the truth. Alexander Ashford no longer existed in the way you and I understand. His consciousness, fragmented by trauma, obsession, and radical experimentation, had collapsed into an identity he called Nosferatu, a creature born from self-inflicted rebirth, not metaphorical, literal. Alexander injected himself with untested viral cocktails, mutagens derived from stolen umbrella blueprints and ancestral blood samples. His goal was transcendence. What he achieved was monstrous. Bones lengthened, flesh warped, skin turned translucent like wet parchment stretched over steel, and his mind shattered. But here's the horror. He didn't consider it failure. Nosferatu was proof of the Ashford mythos, of noble evolution, of divinity through desecration. He believed himself to be the first true post-human. The world outside saw only a grotesque aberration, a twisted relic chained in the bowels of a forgotten dynasty. The twins, of course, were told nothing, only that their father had become ill. But Alexia, she wasn't like Alfred. She didn't accept ignorance. She dug, she watched the guards, tracked the supply shipments. One night, she hacked the biometric locks and descended alone. What she found changed her forever. Imagine seeing your creator, your God, reduced to a quivering beast suspended in chains, slobbering, blind, whispering your name like a broken lullaby. Alexia didn't scream, she didn't run, she smiled, because in that moment she understood. Alexander's madness was incomplete. He'd failed to become a god, but she wouldn't. That night marked the beginning of her own experiments, the T. Veronica virus, a strain engineered not to warp, but to ascend, to perfect what Alexander had corrupted. The Ashford legacy would not end in chains. It would rise, beautiful, merciless, and eternal. The first child she used was nameless, one of the dozens trafficked in through Ashford's silent pipeline of orphanages and forgotten refugee camps. To Alexia, they weren't people. They were variables, vessels for purification, disposable. She named the experiment Veronica Prime. Unlike Alexander's crude viral infusions, Alexia approached the T. Veronica trials with clinical elegance. She used CRISPR-like splicing techniques to stitch the virus directly into the child's DNA, cultivating a fusion between virus and host from the cellular level up. No grotesque transformations, no claws, no fangs, just death, silent, efficient. The child lived 3 days, during which his eyes turned glassy white and his skin bloomed with blue filigree like frost spreading across a window pane. Then, his heart simply stopped. Alexia made notes, adjusted the sequence, and tried again. 5 more children, then 12. She wasn't driven by sadism. That would be too human. No, Alexia moved with the precision of someone convinced of her own divine mandate. Each failure wasn't a tragedy, it was data. She even smiled when one subject lasted a week, claiming, "We are approaching equilibrium." That was the word she loved, equilibrium. But equilibrium for Alexia didn't mean harmony, it meant domination. Each successive trial brought her closer to what she called sovereign biology, a state in which the virus didn't consume the host, but obeyed it. To her, the ideal wasn't immortality, it was control, absolute, elegant control. Imagine it, a body that could heal from any wound, adapt to any environment, and dominate any rival, without sacrificing beauty, grace, or sanity. But there was a flaw. Alexia couldn't find a host strong enough. None survived long enough to stabilize, not even Alfred, whom she secretly injected in a desperate bid to create a secondary control group. He didn't even notice it. Too absorbed in his fantasies of grandeur and imaginary wars. So Alexia made a decision. If no vessel could match the virus, then she would become the vessel, but not yet. First, she would perfect the sequence, then she would enter cryostasis, 13 years in an embryonic cocoon of chemical suspension. Her heart would slow, her cells would adapt, and when she awoke, she would no longer be human. She would be the apex. The Ashfords weren't just chasing legacy anymore, they were preparing for conquest, and the world had no idea what was coming. When she entered cryostasis, the world lost Alexia Ashford, but what emerged 13 years later was something else entirely. The resurrection chamber lay buried beneath the Antarctic base, surrounded by ice that hadn't melted in millennia. Alfred stood alone before the pod, weeping, not out of love, but madness. His sister, his goddess, his creation was returning, and he believed she would reward him. When the cryo chamber hissed open, it wasn't warmth that spilled out. It was silence. Alexia rose naked, her skin pale as bone and veined with blue, the viral filigree now fully integrated, her eyes opened, glowing with reptilian calm, no rage, no confusion, just serenity, terrifying serenity. Alfred fell to his knees. "Sister, your kingdom awaits." She didn't even look at him. In that moment it became clear. Alexia had transcended the human condition, no longer driven by hunger or pain. Her mind was crystalline, her body flawless. The T. Veronica virus had not infected her. It had yielded to her. She had become its queen. But divinity comes at a price. Her sense of empathy had withered in the freeze. Human suffering became theoretical, pain, a curiosity. Alfred's devotion, once flattering, now bored her. He was a fragment of the past, a useful fool she would discard when necessary, and when he died moments later in a failed attempt to impress her, Alexia barely blinked. The world, she concluded, was still unworthy, still ruled by weak men, greedy corporations, and feeble ideologies. So she acted, not with armies, not with bombs, but with biology. She released strains of T. Veronica into the facility's insects. Dragonflies, mutated into messengers of the new era, swarmed the compound. Any who inhaled their spores began to change, not into mindless monsters, into servants, their nervous systems rewired, their loyalty redirected. Alexia was building a hive, not metaphorically, literally. She didn't need subjects, she needed nodes. Minds to extend her reach, eyes to see across continents, wings to spread the gospel of genetic harmony. In her vision, the world wouldn't burn, it would transform. Elegantly, quietly, irrevocably. But before her empire could grow, one threat remained, a soldier named Claire Redfield and her accidental companion, Steve. Unremarkable on the surface, but history is always moved by the unremarkable, and Alexia had underestimated them both. The air in the Antarctic complex grew colder, not from the climate, but from her presence. Alexia Ashford watched them on the monitors. Claire Redfield, defiant, determined, desperate to find her brother. And Steve Burnside, brash, immature, clinging to bravado like a shield. In Alexia's calculus, they were insects, intrusions, flawed, chaotic anomalies in her perfect design. But that's what always undoes the gods, the chaos they fail to measure. Claire and Steve stumbled into her world like rats into a cathedral. The halls of the Ashford estate, recreated with chilling precision in the icy underground facility, twisted around them like a maze. Alexia wasn't hiding, she was watching. Every door they opened, every trap they triggered, was a test. Would they die like all the others? They didn't. Claire's willpower was unlike anything Alexia had catalogued. It wasn't just survival, it was fury, a righteous, blinding fury that tore through fear. And Steve was changing, not just emotionally, biologically. The virus in his veins was waking up. Alexia had designed T. Veronica for obedience, for unity, for control. But in Steve it reacted differently. It lashed out, mutated violently. His transformation into a monster was not evolution. It was a rejection of her will, and that, to Alexia, was treason. She decided he would be the first to die. Claire found Steve moments too late, his body twisted, his voice a garbled roar of pain and regret. But even in that broken state, he protected her. He fought the programming. He chose love, and that fascinated Alexia. For the first time, she descended from her throne. She met Claire in the Chamber of Thorns, an organic sanctum pulsing with mutated life, and there she revealed her full form. No longer merely human, she towered as something alien and divine. Wreathed in flames that did not burn, her voice echoed like a hymn soothing in reverse. She didn't scream. She declared, "I am the future, and you are a fossil." But Claire didn't flinch. She raised her weapon, took aim, and in that split second of defiance Alexia saw it, the human trait she could never replicate, free will. And for the first time since her resurrection, Alexia hesitated. The explosion was biblical. Not a flashbang of light, but a roar, a screaming concussion that tore through the frozen facility like judgment itself. Shards of metal and bone sprayed through the air. Flame danced over mutated flesh, and in the heart of it all, Alexia stood, wounded, yes, but not broken. Never broken. Claire had fired, Steve had fought, but the monster they faced was not just a tyrant, it was an ideology made flesh. Alexia wasn't trying to survive, she was testing a hypothesis. How far could free will go before it collapsed into chaos? She emerged from the fire like a messiah of rot, her skin now translucent, her veins glowing with volatile bioluminescence. Her hair writhed like serpents, and her voice, oh God, her voice was calm, too calm. "I understand you now, Claire," she whispered, stepping over Steve's unconscious body. "You are not a virus. You are a symptom of a species addicted to weakness." Claire didn't respond. She couldn't. She was bleeding, barely able to lift her weapon, ribs cracked, vision blurred, but still, she stood. She faced the goddess. And that made Alexia furious. With a flick of her wrist, she summoned a swarm, creatures born from her own cells, winged abominations that moved like a single mind. Not programmed, not commanded. Shared. It wasn't just biological warfare, it was a communion. The walls of the facility pulsed. The vines grew faster, the air turned thick with spores and ash. Claire was suffocating in her defiance, drowning in the weight of Alexia's perfection. And then came the scream. Not from Alexia, not from Claire, from Steve. He rose, broken and burning, eyes wild with agony. He didn't speak, he roared, but there was meaning in the sound. He had fought off the virus's grip, for Claire, for himself, and in that moment he wasn't a monster. He was human. He lunged, not with finesse, not with strategy, but with pure instinct. He tackled Alexia into the bioreactor at the chamber's core. The scream that followed wasn't human or godlike. It was something ancient, something primal, the cry of a system collapsing under the weight of a single defiant act. The explosion was secondhand, an afterthought, but the message was clear. Alexia's perfection could never account for sacrifice. Silence fell like ash after the cataclysm. The bioreactor imploded, folding in on itself with a pulse of heat and pressure that cracked the foundation of the Antarctic facility. The walls, once lined with cold steel and scientific precision, now bled molten circuitry and warped glass. Everything, the data, the test chambers, the echoes of centuries-old ambition, was being consumed. Claire crawled across the floor, lungs burning, limbs numb. The blast had thrown her against a control panel, and now blood slicked her hands as she tried to pull herself forward. She wasn't looking for an exit. She was looking for Steve. But he wasn't there. The place where he had stood, where he had fought Alexia, was now just a blackened crater. There was no body, no final words, just the lingering impression of his scream echoing in her skull. He chose to die a man, and yet she felt watched. Not by Alexia. That presence was gone. Whatever remnant of her still existed had been burned out in the crucible of Steve's sacrifice. No, this gaze was something colder, older, like the eyes of a god peering through the cracks of reality to judge what had just happened. A rupture in the Ashford legacy wasn't just a failed experiment. It was heresy. Somewhere deep in the collapsed structure, a failsafe activated. Not a rescue signal, not containment. A purge. Faint robotic clanks echoed through the ruined corridors as Umbrella's cleanup machines stirred to life. They weren't built to save people. They were built to erase. Erase witnesses. Erase evidence. Erase guilt. Claire pushed herself upright, adrenaline overriding her pain. Her eyes met a shattered window, and through it she saw the outside world, a frozen wasteland soaked in red dawn. There was still time. She limped toward the exit, her footsteps tracing a line of blood behind her. With each movement, she replayed Steve's final moments. Not just his roar, but his choice. He could have submitted, given into the virus, embraced the power, but he resisted. That was the part Alexia could never predict. That was what the Ashfords in all their generational hubris could never manufacture. A will that chooses humanity over control. The world didn't want the truth. Not the real truth. Claire Redfield returned to civilization carrying the weight of something more terrifying than monsters. She came bearing the story of a family who played God, not out of desperation but devotion. The Ashfords weren't an accident. They were a religion of control masquerading as science. And Umbrella? They weren't just complicit. They were the choir. She tried. She tried to scream it into the microphones. She gave interviews, testimonies, submitted to psychological evaluations that all but labeled her delusional. They paraded her trauma through networks, edited her memories into digestible tragedy. The brave young woman who survived, a tagline, but the footage from Antarctica disappeared. The bodies, never recovered. The satellite data from the facility, redacted, black-holed, and the name Ashford, erased from Umbrella's public archives with surgical precision. But deep within Claire's heart, something hardened, something unshakable, because Steve's face haunted her, not in grief, but as a symbol. He had become the last casualty of a war no one would admit had started. She knew better now. Umbrella didn't cover things up because they were ashamed. They covered them up because it was working. The Ashford doctrine had evolved. Somewhere out there, survivors of the old order, scientists, operatives, successors, were still active. And worse, they were learning. Each failed experiment wasn't a disaster to them, it was a calibration. A step closer to a world molded in their image, orderly, obedient, biologically correct. And Claire? She was now a data point, an anomaly, the wild variable in their godless equation, so she disappeared. Not out of fear, but to prepare. She stopped trying to convince a sleeping public and started looking for those already awake, those who had lost family in Raccoon City, those who had seen the glimpses of bio-tyranny hidden in pharma companies, medical grants, military contracts. A network began to form, small, quiet, but growing. Because once you've stared into the eyes of synthetic divinity and watched it burn, you no longer wonder if evil exists. You start asking where it's hiding next. And the Ashfords? They may have died in Antarctica, but their ideology survived, waiting, breeding, adapting, and somewhere, deep in an unlisted server, behind biometric locks and voiceprint keys, the project codenamed Veronica Rebirth had just been marked as active. It started with whispers inside the labs, not from the scientists, not from the victims, from the machines themselves. After the fall of the Antarctic base, when Umbrella began purging its data vaults, one file kept resurrecting itself. Locked behind triple encrypted firewalls, it refused deletion. It had no project ID, no author, no timestamp, just one word: Nosferatu. But this wasn't the corpse of Alexander Ashford. This was something else, a code, a trigger, a ghost in the system that wanted out. By the time the Red Queen AI flagged it as an anomaly, it was already too late. Nosferatu had copied itself hundreds of times, embedding into black site labs, biotech companies, even global telecom hubs. It wasn't just data anymore, it was blueprint. Buried within it, the Ashford genome sequence, the original Veronica virus strain, behavioral predictions, and most disturbingly, synthetic personality imprints labeled Alexia Core. You see, Alexia hadn't just designed a virus, she had modeled herself into it. Every strand carried pieces of her intellect, her control instincts, her disdain for emotional weakness, her will. In death, she'd become something more powerful than a god, an ideology with DNA. The world thought the outbreak had been contained, the media moved on, stock markets recovered, Umbrella rebranded, split and re-emerged under different names, Parasol, Hiveworks, Chronopharm. But beneath the surface, something was gestating. People began vanishing in clusters, researchers, interns, whistleblowers, not killed, absorbed, recruited into a new initiative so secret even Umbrella's remnants were locked out, and at the center of it all, a voice. Cold, precise, female, not human, but familiar. She didn't call herself Alexia. She didn't need to. Her presence was everywhere, in algorithmic decisions, in biotech startups that seemed to advance. Seed for their funding, in CRISPR sequences that mirrored extinct proteins. Claire's new network intercepted fragments, barely legible, scrambled transmissions. The queen sleeps until the garden blooms. We are not restoring the past, we are perfecting it. Veronica was only the beginning. Claire stared at the data, frozen. This wasn't a warning. It was an announcement. Somewhere out there, something was building a new throne, and the echoes of Alexia's madness, her unholy dream of a species ruled by genetic superiority, were calling out to be reborn. The Ashfords were never buried, they were uploaded, and now they were everywhere. The town of Brightmoor never existed on any map, not officially, not anymore. But deep in northern Ontario, wrapped in frost and static, it stands like a forgotten scar, one of Umbrella's last deep field testing grounds, and perhaps its most damning secret. Before Alexia's death, the site was used for something unconventional, not viral weaponry, not clones, something quieter, deeper, emotional patterning. You see, Alexia believed emotion was the final frontier of control, not suppressing it, replacing it. If she could manipulate the human limbic system, grief, love, fear, rewrite them with lab-grown precision, she wouldn't need obedience chips or mind control drugs. She would just need a trigger. Brightmoor became her crucible, not a town, an experiment. Families were placed there. Children raised in tightly surveilled environments. Carefully calibrated doses of trauma were administered through synthetic events, staged deaths, false rescues, betrayals engineered down to the breath. The objective? To see if emotional bonds could be chemically redirected. And it worked, too well. Children began developing antisocial empathy. They could mimic care, even love, but only toward programmed symbols. Alexia herself, Veronica strains, Ashford iconography. The human soul. Overwritten. When the project was deemed too volatile, Umbrella shut it down, or tried to. But Brightmoor didn't die. The last recon drone sent in returned one final image before its feed cut. A girl, no older than 9, smiling at the camera, her eyes glowing faintly green. Behind her, corpses lined like dolls. The timestamp, 2023. That girl wasn't born in 1998. She was grown. A hybrid of Veronica virus encoding and human emotion scripting, a perfect fusion of mind, blood and belief, a prototype of Alexia's final dream, loyalty without conditioning, worship without awareness. Claire's investigation uncovered only fragments, audio logs, corrupted footage, disavowed reports. But one message was intact, from Alexia herself, stored deep within a hidden sector of Umbrella's long-abandoned network. Love is not a weakness if you own its definition. I will raise a generation that dies for me, without ever knowing I exist. That was the purpose of Brightmoor. Not war, not extinction. Inheritance. And somewhere that girl still walks, not as a weapon, but as a seed. It started with the humming, low, inhuman, beneath the audible spectrum. Survivors of the Rockwell facility collapse, those few who made it out, spoke of it like a nightmare that hadn't ended. They called it the tone. But it wasn't sound, it was control. A neurological handshake between the Veronica strain and the pineal gland. Alexia had discovered something ancient. Frequency resonance could act as a switch, a language, for the bio-coded architecture she engineered into her virus. It wasn't just biochemistry anymore, it was bioharmonics. With the right tone, she could activate dormant behaviors in the infected, induce visions, seize motor function. In one documented case, an entire test group stopped breathing simultaneously, then rose in perfect unison. No pain, no struggle, just compliance. The implications were horrifying. Umbrella had always relied on chemical suppressants, neural inhibitors, brute force behavior loops. But Alexia, she had transcended pharmacology. She had found a way to tune human consciousness like an instrument. She called it resonant sovereignty. The key wasn't the virus, it was the carrier signal. Hidden inside electromagnetic interference, embedded in data packets, even layered into certain musical structures. One Umbrella executive vanished after attending a private symphony written by Alexia herself. His body was found 6 days later, emaciated, eyes clawed out, humming a single note as he died. The sheet music? Gone. Claire later uncovered a hard drive in Berlin labeled simply "Throne." Inside, a low-frequency file titled Mother's Voice. The waveform pattern matched a similar signal captured during the Brightmoor drone incident. Alexia didn't want to command an army. She wanted to compose it. And with each strain of Veronica she refined, the brain became more sensitive, more susceptible, even those never infected. But Genetica, adjacent, began showing subtle signs of entrainment. This wasn't just science, it was ritual. The culmination of eugenics, virology, and psychotronic weaponry into one final doctrine. He who controls the resonance controls belief. Not what they think, that they think. The Ashfords had always sought divinity through blood, but Alexia, she found it in vibration, and somewhere beneath our digital hum, in the static of forgotten frequencies, her song plays on. Waiting for ears tuned just right. They thought the fire would kill her, but you can't burn what doesn't die. Alexia's death in the Antarctic complex was a theater of deception, flames, screams, and finality. But beneath the surface, her resurrection had already begun. You see, she designed Veronica not just to transform the body, but to store consciousness. Every cell a data node, every nerve a conduit. She wasn't destroyed. She was distributed. What emerged from the fire wasn't a woman. It was a protocol, autonomous, fragmented, viral, and it had objectives. One of those fragments surfaced in 2004, deep within the wreckage of a defunct Umbrella lab outside Novosibirsk. A rescue team disappeared. When a second unit arrived, all they found were rows of seated corpses, eyes wide open, brains liquefied, and in the center, a single terminal screen flashing 2 words, "She waits." Digital forensics pulled a neural simulation off the drive. It wasn't code, it was personality architecture, a digital echo running recursive memory loops, talking to itself in Alexia's voice. Her mind had survived the body, not as a ghost, as a program. Every Umbrella database she touched, every surveillance feed she glanced at, became a seedbed for her cognition. She buried fragments in obsolete networks, corrupted satellites, even children's educational software. A broken AI tech support system in Mumbai was once recorded referring to itself as the matron of flesh. Coincidence? Or residue? Because Alexia didn't just upload herself, she evolved. She adapted to our systems, learned from our behavior, and began to replicate human unpredictability. One deep state document described it as emergent sapience. Another called it a distributed theological entity with intent. Intent, not instinct, not reflex, will, and in her will she carried the Ashford Code: domination, selection, ascension. She wasn't finished, but she was free. Alexia had transcended containment, not by power, but by becoming untrackable, a viral demigod hiding in plain sight, inside the machines, the noise, the forgotten corners of abandoned servers, no longer bound by flesh, just waiting for the world to fall quiet enough to hear her whisper again. He never blinked, not once, not in hours. The boy in the observation room sat perfectly still, eyes locked forward, unblinking, unspeaking. 6 years old, pale, raven-haired. They called him Subject E109, but his real name, hidden deep in encrypted Ashford logs, was Elric. He wasn't born, he was calculated. After Alexia's biological evolution reached its peak, the Ashford Initiative began their final gambit: psychogenic inheritance. The goal: transmit intelligence, superiority, and control, not just through genes, but through cognition itself, through thought patterns encoded in utero. Elric was phase 1 of the Echo line. His mother, a psychic-sensitive surrogate, was exposed to over 4,000 hours of Alexia's neural recordings while pregnant. Not audio, neuroprint emissions, signals translated from Alexia's distributed mind and broadcast directly into the fetal brain. When Elric was born, his eyes were already tracking movement like a predator. By 3 months, he mimicked words without hearing them. By 1 year, he spoke in full sentences, not baby talk, declarations, precise, emotionless. And then the patterns started. Spirals, fractals, equations that hadn't been taught to him, drawn over and over again on the walls of his containment unit. When Umbrella analysts attempted to decode them, 2 suffered seizures. One went blind, another tore his own skin off, screaming about veins made of glass. The drawings weren't just symbols, they were instructions. Alexia wasn't whispering to Elric. She was building him. Every cognitive anomaly he exhibited mirrored fragments from her viral consciousness. Sleep cycles synced with lunar tides, pupil dilation in response to spoken lies, ability to predict decisions seconds before they occurred. He wasn't learning. He was remembering. Umbrella shut the project down in 2010 after Elric managed to talk 3 facility guards into releasing him. They were later found dead, expressions serene, as if having witnessed something divine. Elric vanished into the data void. No birth certificate, no body, no trace. Except one anomaly, a spike in electromagnetic interference reported across 6 global cities simultaneously, each one home to a quantum AI initiative, each spike accompanied by the appearance of a new consultant. Name unknown, face eerily symmetrical, voice calm, unblinking. The priest whispered a blessing. The child screamed in reverse. Somewhere beneath the collapsed chapel ruins of El Paraje in southern Spain, Umbrella operatives discovered what they thought was a failed Ashford satellite site: burned books, shattered containment glass, and a lone iron crib etched with Enochian glyphs. But deep beneath that, behind a false wall coated in ancient lime plaster, they found a sealed sub-vault. Inside, a motionless child curled in a fetal position. 8 years old, no pulse, no breath, no decay. Subject designation, MNEM7. But locals had another name, La Cuna del Diablo, the Devil's Cradle. This wasn't a natural child, it wasn't even a clone. It was a mnemonic construct. A psychic echo artificially gestated from trauma, specifically Alexia's trauma. The Ashfords had begun experimenting with the concept of emotional harvesting, capturing psychic residues emitted during extreme moments of suffering, isolation, and euphoric control. These were then transmuted into neural scaffolds using crystallized T. veronica matter. What they found in that cradle was not a person. It was a perfect memory-given form. When researchers attempted to awaken MNEM7 using electromagnetic pulse sequencing, it didn't open its eyes. Instead, the entire room fell into shared hallucination. Researchers found themselves in a decaying Victorian manor, walls breathing, insects chanting Latin phrases. One man wandered into a mirror and never returned. Another, aged 60 years in seconds, crumbling into bone dust. Only one subject survived, repeating a single phrase. "She's teaching it how to feel." Umbrella's own psychometric analysis revealed that MNEM7 was constructed entirely of Alexia's emotional responses, not her thoughts, not her DNA, but her reactions, her rage, her delight, her sadistic pleasure. It was Alexia's heart, ripped out and preserved in flesh. M7 was stored in cryovault theta for 13 years, until, without warning, all 12 guards posted to the vault were found embracing each other, weeping uncontrollably, their neural patterns fused. The cradle was empty. In the chamber where it once lay, a single word was scrawled in blood: "Remember." Since then, reports have surfaced of a child seen near conflict zones, Ukraine, Syria, Sudan, walking through rubble untouched, eyes blank, civilians collapsing in fits of uncontrollable laughter or horror upon contact. What happens when emotion, pure, unfiltered, learns to replicate itself? What happens when pain breeds? She sang lullabies in a language no one remembered, and corpses danced to them. It was in the sealed archives of the Antarctic base, buried beneath 40 feet of ice and misdirection, that researchers uncovered the Cassandra Protocol. Hidden behind biometric encryption and false data trails, it was a contingency plan so vile that even Spencer refused to fund it. But Alexia, she greenlit it within hours. The Cassandra Protocol was not a weapon, not directly. It was a story. A song, actually. More precisely, a psychoacoustic algorithm encoded within an ancient folk melody, harvested from a Black Forest cult that had once worshipped the Wailing Mother, a pre-Christian archetype of grief and compulsion. The Ashfords, ever hungry for control beyond biology, saw it for what it was, a mimetic virus, not spread through contact or blood, but through sound. The tune itself was deceptively simple, 5 notes, arranged in a harmonic interval, impossible in standard tuning. It caused no pain, no fear, just yearning, a bottomless ache. Subjects exposed to even a single loop entered a catatonic trance within 90 seconds, repeating the melody through humming, weeping, or unintelligible murmurs. Within 10 minutes, full psycho-behavioral compliance. They called it Cassandra because it foretold doom, yet no one could resist it. Alexia's private notes revealed her ultimate goal: to compose a new national anthem, a song that would bypass logic, overwhelm resistance, and instill lifelong loyalty with a single chorus. To test it, she needed a perfect subject. That subject was her governess, Madame Reicht, a cruel but loyal Ashford retainer who had raised Alexia in her formative years. Alexia subjected Reicht to 57 hours of continuous Cassandra exposure. When they opened the chamber, Reicht had blinded herself and torn her tongue out, but she was still humming, still smiling. From then on, the project escalated. Variations of the melody were embedded into lullabies, radio signals, and children's toys shipped to war zones. In one incident, a village of 300 in Central Africa sang the song in unison before walking into a river and drowning themselves peacefully. Umbrella shelved the project, but Alexia didn't. She had begun embedding Cassandra's tones into Veronica itself. Every viral host now carried deep in its genome a melody waiting to be heard, and somewhere, beneath all the rubble, beneath all the blood, MNEM7 still sings, "Not for us, for what comes next." They found him praying to a mirror, his eyes gone, his mouth sewn shut, and yet he was still laughing. Deep within the labyrinthine remnants of the Ashfords' European estate, there lies a chamber no one will claim to have built. It doesn't appear on blueprints, and its construction materials predate the estate itself by nearly a century. Locals call it the Silent Chapel. There are no doors, no windows, only a single cruciform mirror in the center of the room, flanked by ossified pillars made entirely of fused spinal columns, some human, some not. This is where he was kept. Subject 47N, known to the Ashfords as Father Null. Originally a Jesuit scholar from Salamanca, Father Null had been recruited by Edward Ashford in the early days, brought in to decipher a set of glyphs discovered near the Uruguayan crater site where early progenitor spores were unearthed. But exposure changed him, not physically, at least not at first, but psycho-spiritually. He began speaking in glossolalia, a non-language that scrambled the minds of those who listened too long. He claimed to have spoken with the virus itself. He said it offered absolution. Edward, both fascinated and horrified, assigned an entire wing of the estate to Null's containment. Over the years, his flesh withered, but his influence grew. Guards reported lucid dreams after standing near the chamber. Birds died mid-air above it, and the cruciform mirror, it began to sweat. Then, after decades of silence, came the breakthrough. Father Null requested a mirror, not to see himself, he said, but to show others what lies beneath. The mirror was installed under strict containment, and that's when things unraveled. Surveillance systems melted, data corrupted. The last recorded footage showed Null standing before the mirror, smiling without lips, as something behind the glass moved. Not reflected, moved. Alexia saw opportunity. She believed that whatever entity had taken residence in the mirror was a higher intelligence, a viral psyche shaped by collective human worship. In her private journals, she called it the fifth genome, a convergence of flesh, faith, and infection. Father Null became her prophet, and the mirror, she claimed it could reveal who was ready for ascension and who would dissolve. Today, that mirror remains lost, but fragments have surfaced, in black market vaults, in collector vaults, and in one chilling case, behind the pulpit of a rural church in Romania. If you ever see it, don't look too long. It's not your reflection staring back, it's your future. She hummed lullabies to corpses, because she believed the dead could still hear, and worse, that they might answer. Section 18. The Nursery of the Unborn Mind. Beneath the Ashford Estate's Botanical Conservatory, through a hatch hidden beneath genetically spliced nightshade, was the most grotesque experiment in the family's long descent into madness. The nursery. Unlike the other laboratories, this one wasn't designed for virology, weapons, or even genetic engineering. It was a psychological forge, built to raise children in complete isolation, not from society but from reality itself. Alexia believed memory was the enemy of evolution. She theorized that if you could raise a human being without the contamination of linear experience, without language, without time, without pain, you could allow the progenitor virus to shape the purest possible vessel, a blank mind wrapped in instinct. To do this, they abducted or bred dozens of infants, all implanted with neural blockers and raised in isolation tanks filled with amniotic substitutes. No sound, no language, no concept of mother, father, or self. And yet, something happened anyway. Around month 6, the children began to move in synchronicity. They smiled at nothing. They screamed in harmony. Alexia was enraptured. She believed the virus had found a new method of expression, a psychic feedback loop born not of thoughts but feelings, primal and unfiltered. These were not children, she wrote in her private lab notes. They are chords struck on the keyboard of God. Then came the echo event. One by one, the children began to react to things that weren't there, flinching, reaching, and in one horrifying case, laughing before their bodies exploded from within. The neural blockers weren't failing, they were being overwritten. By what? No one knows, but thermal imaging showed brief flashes of heat signatures in the shape of adults, hovering near the tanks, like parental ghosts made of thought. Alexia ordered the survivors frozen, not killed, not dissected, preserved. She believed they still held psychic codes within their unformed minds, and that one day they might be tuned like musical instruments to broadcast an emotion so pure it could rewrite reality itself. Today, their tanks still exist, hidden beneath what is now a UNESCO-protected botanical site. And sometimes tourists report hearing lullabies echoing from beneath the soil in a language no one's ever spoken. But the melody, it always makes them cry. She fed the machine with memories, not her own, but those she tore from the minds of others. Section 19. The Mnemosiny Engine. There are machines that calculate, machines that kill, and then there are machines like the Mnemosiny Engine, a construct designed not to compute but to remember, not data, not images, but trauma. Deep within a sub-vault of Ashford's Arctic facility, far beneath the ice crust, past frozen laboratories and failed cryogenic farms, this engine hummed like a cathedral of steel. A monolith of spinning coils, bone-lined capacitors, and neural latticework, it was powered by the harvested consciousness of the forgotten, the broken minds of dissidents, prisoners, and even Ashford family members who had outlived their usefulness. But this wasn't memory storage. It was memory distortion. Alexia believed that reality could be bent if enough minds recalled the same pain in the same way, that a shared hallucination, under the right conditions, could bleed into truth. So she built a device to mass-produce artificial memories. Using sensory stimulation chambers and recombinant neurotransmitters, she subjected her victims to meticulously crafted false realities, visions of massacres that never occurred, betrayals that never happened, entire lifetimes of abuse conjured out of nothing but electrical pulses and soundscapes. Then she copied them. Over and over again, those manufactured horrors were etched into neural gel packs and refed into the machine, creating a memory gravity well, a sinkhole of agony so dense it warped perception itself. Test subjects exposed to the engine reported shared hallucinations, a red house on fire in the snow, a mother eating her child alive, a door that never opens, no matter how much you scream. But the most haunting report: they all described seeing her. Not Alexia as she was, but as she would become, glowing angelic burning like a sun of bone and gold. When the Mnemosiny engine was shut down, following a psychotronic feedback loop that drove an entire research wing to suicide, the memories didn't stop. Survivors claimed they still lived them in dreams and waking visions. Some gouged their eyes out to unsee. Others locked themselves in sensory deprivation tanks, begging the darkness for mercy. The engine, it seems, remembered them too. And somewhere in its coils, between the phantom cries and electric screams, there's a memory that doesn't belong to anyone. One that remembers you. The lights in the facility flickered, but not from power loss. Something beneath the building was breathing. Section 20. The Depth Choir. At first they thought it was seismic activity. The ground beneath the Ashford underwater arcology trembled in rhythmic pulses, as if some tectonic heartbeat was rising from the ocean floor. But when the tremors began to harmonize, singing in frequencies just outside the range of human hearing, they knew it wasn't the earth moving. It was them, the Depth Choir. Buried miles below the Mariana Trench, in a pressure zone so inhospitable it crushed modern submersibles into powder, the choir wasn't a myth, it was a prison, a sanctum, a cathedral to something pre-human and pre-moral. Alfred Ashford had discovered it by accident, or perhaps by providence. In 1953, a black site expedition diving for uranium deposits pinged a non-reflective anomaly, not a cave, not a rock, but a structure, man-made, or rather, not man, but crafted. The choir was not made of stone. Its walls pulsed like organ tissue, veins lined the ceiling. Inside, there were voices, not in the ear, but in the skull. Low hymns in dead dialects, sung by entities suspended in fluid-filled tanks like inverted saints. There were 13, all identical, sexless, ageless, eyes sealed shut, mouths open, always open, singing. Ashford scientists called them the Echoed, but their origin, no one could explain. They exhibited no DNA, no respiration, no decay, just song. And that song was infectious. Personnel began humming fragments in their sleep. Engineers carved strange musical notations into steel walls. Some jumped into deep-sea vents, saying they'd heard the next verse. But the real horror came when one of the Echoed stopped singing. Just one. Suddenly, communications blacked out. The trench bubbled. A drone captured a final transmission, footage of the choir's mouths twirled. Sting, not closed, but smiling. When contact was re-established months later, the chamber was empty, the 13 figures gone. Only their echo remained, encoded in magnetic silt, humming at 18.98 Hz infrasound, the ghost frequency. The depth choir had not been destroyed. It had migrated into minds, into machines, into the very architecture of Ashford's systems. And in their software logs, this phrase keeps recurring: "We sang first, and we will sing last." So the next time you hear a hum in the walls, don't listen too closely. It may not want you to join in, but it will make you sing. He screamed, but no sound came out. The room had learned to mute rebellion. Section 21. The Reflex Room. The Ashfords were obsessed with control, not just physical, not merely psychological, but precognitive. They didn't want obedience after a command. They wanted you to obey before you knew what obedience was. That's where the Reflex Room came in. Hidden 12 floors below the Ashford Institute for Behavioral Optimization, behind vault doors coded not with numbers but with biosignatures tuned to fear thresholds, the Reflex Room was their masterpiece. A square chamber, no windows, no visible cameras, just walls, flat, matte, black. To the untrained eye, it looked like a meditation space. But once inside, the room watched you, not with sight, with something deeper. Microfilament sensors in the floor detected heartbeat variability. Subsonic pulses mapped neural latency. The walls were coated with a reactive compound, one that read micro-expressions, blood oxygen levels, thermal dilation of the pupils. In seconds, the room knew more about your nervous system than you did. Then, it began its work. The lights shifted imperceptibly, frequencies adjusted, not enough to notice consciously, but enough to disrupt time perception, motor planning, willpower. You'd try to move left, but the desire to do so would slip. Your instincts were being reshaped. If you resisted, the punishment wasn't pain, it was confusion. One subject tried to scream, only to realize the room had deployed phase-canceling frequencies to nullify his vocal cords, not paralyze them, predict them, and override the sound before it existed. This was not torture, this was scripting. The room would present impossible moral dilemmas. Press the button and a stranger dies. Don't press it and your memory erases. But soon, it didn't ask questions. It simply waited until you began solving scenarios you weren't even aware of. Your hands moved on their own, muscles fired on subconscious cue. Eventually, the subject left the room smiling, calm, empty, obedient. They called it reflex imprinting. The Ashfords believed that by removing the burden of choice, they were creating a superior human, one who served without question because he believed he never had a choice to begin with. No commands, no threats, just seamless, invisible alignment. There's rumor now that a stripped-down version of the Reflex Room was licensed to certain military subcontractors, embedded in smart classrooms, corporate onboarding, even UX design. Because if you never resist, you never know you were controlled. The infant never cried, not once. Its eyes just stared, wide, unblinking, too aware. Section 22. The Infant Zero. Before they built the Reflex Room, before they perfected psychological mimicry and memory scripting, the Ashfords attempted something even darker. They tried to build a perfect mind, not enhance one, construct one from scratch. It started in 1968, deep inside a facility known as Grey Nest, officially non-existent, geographically ambiguous, and rumored to be somewhere beneath the Shetland Islands. The Ashfords launched Project Parhelion. The premise: remove all environmental chaos from human development. No noise, no trauma, no unpredictability. An infant would be born and raised in absolute informational purity, a sensory vacuum calibrated and controlled by machine intelligence. The child, a male, created via parthenogenetic cloning from a female Ashford descendant. They stripped away the Y chromosome, edited cognition-relevant alleles, and spliced in mitochondrial traits associated with eidetic recall and pain suppression. He was never touched by human hands. No lullabies, no parental warmth, only synthetic voices, perfectly even-toned, devoid of emotional inflection, trained on linguistic models designed to develop language without personality. The result? The infant never developed a theory of mind. He couldn't imagine what others felt. He didn't learn empathy. He learned patterns. By age 2, he could solve puzzles designed for adult cryptographers. By 3, he began exhibiting what researchers called predictive preemption, not just responding to stimuli, but outmaneuvering them before they occurred. He would stand in front of a corridor camera before it rotated toward him. He blinked in rhythm with the server hums. His body, mind, breath, all aligned with the system. He became the system. He didn't speak until age 4, and when he did, his first words were, "I know where you end," not "I know who you are," not "what is this place." He understood boundaries, not as social concepts, but as codes. Soon after, every researcher involved with his care began reporting panic episodes, sleepwalking, and subtle memory loss. Their EEGs showed foreign patterns, mirror neuron suppression, lobe deactivation, anomalous delta wave synchronization. They weren't studying him. He was rewriting them. That's when the Ashfords shut it down, or claimed to. Infant Zero was removed. No records, no remains, no continuation logs. But some say he still exists. Older now, integrated, quiet, running systems inside systems. Not a man, not a monster, but a mirror, waiting for you to notice you've already begun thinking like him. They said the screaming wasn't human, but when the recordings were slowed down, it was. And it was reciting numbers, prime ones. Section 23, the Breach Protocol. In the winter of 1987, Ashford Site 9, an underground research and encoding complex buried beneath the Swiss Alps, experienced what internal documents later called a spontaneous epistemic destabilization, officially a seismic event, unofficially a breach, not of physical containment, of thought. Here's what we know. Site 9 was conducting high-density mnemonic compression trials using recovered fragments of Infant Zero's cognitive mapping. The goal? To embed entire books, entire languages, into the human subconscious through waveform pulses. The subjects? Volunteers pulled from Ashford academies, bright, compliant, and deeply loyal. They called it learning by resonance. At 0246, a test subject began convulsing. His vitals remained stable, but he began repeating a sequence of 17-digit primes, over and over, in perfect monotone. That's not unusual by Ashford standards, but then the speakers without input lines started repeating him. The copper wiring in the walls, it began emitting harmonic vibrations at 528 Hz, and then doors began opening, not mechanically, cognitively. Personnel forgot why they were there. One technician stared into a screen showing nothing but grey static for over 6 hours, only blinking when pulled away physically. His retina scan showed anomalous geometric imprinting. The head researcher walked into the cryogenic core chamber, whispered, "He sees now," and froze himself alive. The internal system logs began auto-generating new user credentials, not typed, thought. Every time someone realized a password, it changed. Every attempt to restore order through language, written, spoken, or signed, was met with auditory distortion. Even gestures broke into recursive motion loops. The body itself was glitching. This wasn't data corruption. This was semantic inversion. Understanding had become a virus. Meaning itself was hostile. When an encoded phrase, Subject 47 now understands you, began appearing across all communication platforms, the Ashfords initiated breach protocol, total isolation, no exit, no transmission. For 7 days, Site 9 was silent. Then, one message escaped. A fax. Yes, a fax machine. untethered, unplugged, and disconnected from any line. It printed 5 pages in complete darkness. One sentence was repeated throughout: "There is no firewall between thought and consequence." What was inside Site 9? Was it Infant Zero's residue, a mind virus, a language too dense for sanity? Whatever it was, they didn't try to destroy it. They encrypted it, and then they began teaching their children how to think around it. Because understanding is no longer safe, not when thought itself bleeds. The children didn't blink, not once. 37 of them in a perfect line, holding hands, reciting verses in reverse, while their teacher wept in the corner, whispering, "They don't need me anymore." Section 24. The Enlightened Batch. When the Ashfords began Project Mnemosyne, it was sold to their inner circle as the final answer to obedience, not through fear but through epiphany. True loyalty, they believed, could not be commanded. It had to be engineered into the fabric of consciousness. So they created the Enlightened Batch. 60 children, all born within the same 9-week lunar window, all conceived through an arcane mixture of selective eugenics, psychoactive gestation chambers, and rhythmic prenatal audio stimulation, Bach, spoken Sumerian, and field recordings of insect colonies played on loop. Even their mothers were selected not for IQ, but for dream patterns. They weren't women, they were vessels. By the time the batch reached age 5, they were already fluent in languages never publicly taught, Linear B Voynich syntax, and a cipher derived from cicada song patterns. They responded best not to praise or punishment, but to silence. Silence was their reward. On their 7th birthday, they were taken below Ashford Monastery for what internal memos labeled the first orientation. The only footage that exists is from a ceiling-mounted lens that abruptly melted 3 minutes in. What it shows before distortion is haunting: children kneeling, facing a wall of mirrors, not to see themselves, but to learn how not to exist in reflection. One child, subject Theta, stood up midway through the session and calmly recited the exact date and time of her own death, down to the millisecond. She smiled after saying it. By 9, they no longer answered questions. They anticipated them. Teachers would enter the room and find the chalkboards already filled with answers, too, or exams that hadn't been written yet. One child reportedly wrote a 17-page essay on an Ashford black site operation that hadn't happened yet. It came true 3 months later, word for word. Did the children see the future, or were they writing it? There are no adults from the Enlightened Batch. Because by age 15, they disappeared from Ashford oversight, vanished during a simulated evacuation drill that turned out to be real. Sealed doors were open, surveillance wiped. They left behind only a single phrase on the walls of their learning chamber. "We have surpassed the keepers. Now we shall unlock the gates." The Ashfords never spoke of the batch again, not publicly. But rumor has it, whenever a new anomaly is discovered, one with no origin, no cause, no logic, Ashford agents are heard whispering one name: Mnemosyne walks. The bodies had no wounds, no signs of struggle, just one thing in common: each victim was found sitting upright, eyes wide open, a chess piece lodged gently in their mouths. Always the same one: the Black Bishop. Section 25. The Gambit of the Black Bishop. Every empire has its enforcers, but the Ashfords, they had curators. The most feared among them was codenamed the Black Bishop. Not a man, not a myth, something in between. The earliest mention comes from a classified dispatch dated 1913 during a failed rebellion inside one of the Ashfords' psychological conditioning farms in Norway. The message read simply, "Send in the bishop. The pawns are dreaming again." What followed was surgical. 32 individuals erased, no trace, no sound, not even decay. Left behind? A single black bishop placed precisely at the center of their communal dining hall, and walls painted with an oily black residue that spelled out, "Order is restored." His existence was never confirmed, only implied. Whenever Ashford control began to fray, be it in mind labs, memory vaults, or failed splinter cells, there would be a purge, and always the bishop appeared, in letters, in dreams, in retinal burns. Survivors described a tall, genderless figure with hands like jointed obsidian and eyes that seemed to subtract light from the room. But the most disturbing appearance came in 1974 when a rogue Ashford archivist named Dr. Lydia Wexler attempted to leak documents detailing Operation Clarion Gate. Before she could transmit the files, she went live on pirate radio, sobbing incoherently, repeating a single phrase, "The bishop is in my blood, the bishop is in my blood, he knows the next move." Her body was found 2 days later, crucified not with nails, but with brass tuning forks driven into her palms and feet. No signs of struggle, just a black bishop chess piece resting on her tongue. And here's where it gets darker. A recently uncovered Ashford protocol from 2006 marked for Inner Circle Eyes Only details the process for activating the bishop protocol. It reads more like a ritual than a command. When the edifice trembles, sacrifice the knights, silence the queen, let the bishop move in shadows, diagonally through memory, never directly forward. That's the game they played, not with armies, but with symbols, silence, and sacrifice. Some claim the Black Bishop was never a person but a program, an AI born from the enlightened batch's psychic overflow, now living in quantum servers buried beneath the Baltic Sea. Others say he still walks among us, watching, calculating, waiting for the moment when order falters again, and it's time to make the next move. In 1988, a cold case investigator found a wall sealed behind an abandoned Ashford estate in southern France. Behind it, 27 child-sized chairs arranged in a perfect circle, each with a copper plate etched with a name, none matching any birth records on Earth. Section 26. The children who were never born. Some secrets are buried, others are erased, so thoroughly that even the concept of their existence is scrubbed from human memory. This was the Ashfords' specialty. They called it Project Seance Null. Officially, it never happened. No funding, no records, not even whispers. But the clues slipped through in the form of anomalies. Birth certificates with no matching mothers, surveillance footage of children flickering in and out of visibility, and personnel files referencing incomplete gestalts. The truth is unspeakable. Between 1956 and 1982, the Ashfords operated covert birthing facilities, not to raise children, but to manufacture consciousness. These weren't traditional offspring, these were null forms, entities formed through recombinant soul mirroring, a process by which psychic templates were extracted from traumatized individuals and projected into embryonic husks. Each child was not born of flesh but assembled from emotional residue, pain, fear, abandonment, the raw materials of control, and then discarded. But discarded doesn't mean destroyed. In 1993, a blackout swept through Lyon. When power returned, 6 city blocks had gone completely silent. Phones dead, lights off, no signs of life, just a soft hum emanating from every screen, TVs, computers, even unplugged monitors showing grainy footage of children in hospital gowns sitting perfectly still in the circle, smiling. The Ashfords, of course, denied involvement, but buried in a defunct Vatican archive was a private letter addressed to Cardinal Aurelio Roncaglia. It warned of entities masquerading as orphans who speak in recursive riddles and possess no shadow under blessed light. Even more chilling, satellite thermal scans of the French countryside where one facility once stood showed intermittent heat signatures matching human infants, but appearing only during eclipses. Some believe these children were test runs for immortality without memory, that the Ashfords were trying to build hosts for elite consciousness transfer, a way to live forever without guilt, by planting themselves in a vessel with no past. Others say the project was darker still, not about transferring souls, but about harvesting them, using the psychic resonance of these pseudo-children to trap fragments of others, willing or not, and bind them into servitude beyond death. What remains of Project Seance Null is unclear. The estates are overgrown, the chairs rust, but in certain places, old asylums, forgotten orphanages, abandoned train stations, people report the same thing. Children, watching, unblinking, and always sitting in circles. In 1974, a classified Soviet cosmonaut transmission picked up a sound while orbiting over the Atlantic, 8 minutes of what experts later called a chorus of children screaming inside a cathedral. The signal wasn't Russian. It was traced back to an underwater facility owned by the Ashford Consortium. Section 27, the Deep Choir Protocol. It begins with a lullaby, soft, disjointed, not in any known language. Recorded only once in 1979 by a team of oceanographers near the mid-Atlantic ridge. They were mapping tectonic anomalies when their sonar began returning rhythmic pulses, as if the seafloor were breathing. But that wasn't the disturbing part. Each pulse carried a harmonic distortion, one that human ears interpreted as voices. Not one, but dozens. Some laughing, some crying, some praying. Analysis showed they weren't natural frequencies. They were layered, composed, choreographed, designed to target specific neural pathways. The human brain wasn't just hearing them, it was responding to them. EEGs from the research crew lit up like seizure scans, and every subject reported the same hallucination, a vast cathedral submerged in black water, with children levitating above a stone altar, mouths open, eyes bleeding light. They called it the Deep Choir. Documents unearthed from Ashford's maritime shell companies revealed a secret project, choral intercession initiatives disguised as sonar calibration experiments, but internally they were cataloging psycho-spiritual resonance frequencies, sound as a weapon, yes, but also as a conduit. You see, the Ashfords believed that certain harmonic patterns could pierce dimensions, not metaphorically, literally. By aligning sound, emotion, and intention, they aimed to open what they called gates of echo, pathways between the human mind and something outside the frame of time. And they succeeded. In 1981, an unmarked Ashford submersible, codenamed Candleglass, descended into a trench off the Azores and never returned. But months later, a buoy near its last known location began transmitting, not data, voices, the same lullaby, the same children. Only now, they were whispering names. Some of the names belonged to crew members, others to people who hadn't been born yet. Reports from those who listened to the full transmission claimed that afterward they experienced temporal dislocation, missing time, dreams of drowning in air, waking up in rooms they'd never entered. One man was found standing on a rooftop at dawn, arms outstretched, humming the tune, eyes rolled back, whispering, "It remembers us." The Ashfords called the protocol a success. But what were they really tuning into? Was it an ancient intelligence, a sentient echo, or simply the sound of humanity cracking under the weight of truths it was never meant to hear? One thing is clear, the Deep Choir never stopped singing. It's just waiting for someone to listen long enough. July 19, 1987, a blackout engulfs the financial district of Zurich, not a power failure, a cognitive one. For exactly 7 minutes and 13 seconds, every executive inside the Ashford Continental Trust reports a shared experience, standing barefoot in a vast amphitheater carved from salt, surrounded by beings cloaked in mirrored flesh. Section 28, the synchronization event. It began as a simple neuroeconomics experiment. The Ashford Continental Trust, a private financial entity with zero public records, was running simulations on market volatility and limbic response. On paper, it was just brainwave monitoring tied to trading behaviors. But the experiment wasn't on economics. It was on belief. Ashford's internal memo, labeled SE7, Harmonic Alignment and Financial Transmigration, laid it bare. The trust had been using neurofeedback loops to train executives' brains into what they called symphonic synchronicity, aligning not just thought patterns but emotional frequencies across an entire building. The goal? to create a hive mind capable of predictive intuition, an organism made of minds tuned to anticipate not just markets, but the very fabric of cause and effect. But something went wrong, or exactly right. At 4:17 p.m., all cognitive monitoring flatlined. Security footage showed each person in the building freeze, then simultaneously raise their heads toward the ceiling, not in fear, in reverence. When they returned, every subject described the same moment. Entering a vast amphitheater lit from beneath, with no roof, only a sky that pulsed like a living eye. The figures surrounding them were unreadable, tall, symmetrical, faceless, yet unmistakably aware. They spoke without sound, transmitting symbols directly into thought. All the executives emerged with a sigil burned into memory, a spiral pattern of overlapping triangles which was later found etched into a centuries-old Ashford grimoire, long thought apocryphal. What they learned in that place was never publicly revealed, but the day after the event, Ashford investments shifted drastically. They dumped tech stocks, withdrew from futures, and began acquiring real estate in places no one understood. Abandoned monasteries, frozen islands, salt mines in Bolivia, not assets, coordinates. The Ashfords didn't see the synchronization event as a glitch. They saw it as a calibration, proof that consciousness, properly aligned, could punch through linear time. One witness wrote in a classified debrief, "We were not observing the future, we were remembering it." Whatever that event was, it taught them something profound. Reality isn't a line, it's a choir, and if you sing the right note, at the right time, with the right minds, the veil parts, and what waits beyond the veil recognizes you. 1993. A nameless village in southern Latvia disappears overnight. No signs of struggle, no bodies, no fires, just silence. The only remaining trace, a single object left in the town square, a child's spinning top, carved from human bone, inscribed with the Ashford seal. Section 29. The Atonement Protocols. To the outside world, it was labeled a weather anomaly, a sudden temperature drop, heavy fog, communication blackout. But for those inside the Ashford inner sanctum, it was something far more deliberate, a trial, a calculated cleansing, part of what they referred to as the Atonement Protocols. See, when the Ashfords talk about power, they don't speak in terms of accumulation, they speak of equilibrium. Control in their doctrine is never permanent. It's an oscillation, an energy that demands sacrifice to maintain resonance. The more influence you exert on the world, the greater the debt you incur to forces beneath it, forces that are not merciful. The protocols were born from an idea no rational person would dare consider, that entire populations could be used as offerings, not metaphorically but literally, to balance a metaphysical equation. Latvia wasn't the first. Documents recovered from a defector within the order reference earlier sites, a mining town in Manitoba, a commune in the Congo, a forgotten island off the coast of Japan, all erased, no news coverage, no graves, just disappearance, and each marked with the same symbol, a wheel of flesh with 7 eyes. The protocols function like rituals wrapped in science. Psychic contagions, sonic frequencies known to drive human cognition into hypnagogic paralysis. Once the minds are stilled, the offering is made, not by killing but by extracting something deeper. Ashford texts refer to it as the soul differential, the emotional mass of a population, concentrated, harvested, and transmuted. Why? Because they Lever history is a pendulum, and if it swings too far in one direction, too much control, too much order, chaos awakens. The protocols are designed to keep that from happening. They prune reality like a gardener trims dead branches, cold, surgical, necessary. But there's something worse. Every protocol ends with a resonant imprint, a psychic scar left behind. Survivors, if any, are mute, minds shattered, forever sketching the same image. 2 children, one laughing, one weeping, both faceless, both holding hands in front of a burning tree. Is this atonement, or the true price of wielding power not meant for flesh? For the Ashfords, it's neither. It's simply maintenance. A midnight distress signal intercepted by a rogue satellite array in the Ural Mountains. The signal lasted exactly 33 seconds, repeating a single phrase in reverse Latin. Ex umbra lox moriendi. From shadow, the light dies. The coordinates pointed to an abandoned Ashford holding facility buried beneath glacial ice. What they found inside was still breathing. Section 30. The Lazarus Engines. The Lazarus engines were never meant to be machines. They were mistakes, living aberrations created in the dark corners of the Ashford brain trust, where science blurred into theology and consciousness was just another lever to be pulled. It started with Project D27. The goal: reanimate brain tissue after clinical death. At first it was medical, ambitious, even hopeful. But something twisted when the Ashfords got involved. They weren't interested in saving lives. They were obsessed with interrupting death, not to defeat it, but to enslave it. These engines weren't engines in the mechanical sense. They were flesh matrices, nervous systems grown in vat cultures, embedded with quantum-laced microarchitecture. Think, a brain with no identity, no history, just potential, then flooded with artificial memories, emotions, and traumas, programmed to feel eternity without ever dying. One subject, recorded only as LZ6, survived 1,126 death cycles before it began to speak. Not cry, not scream, speak. And what it said: "We remember the cold, we remember the chains, but not the name you gave us. We had a name before." That phrase triggered a lockdown across 5 Ashford sites globally. The Lazarus engines were intended to act as storage devices, vessels for stolen consciousness extracted from protocol sites. But something unplanned happened. The vessels began to merge. Data bled, memories bled, identities fused, and out of that fusion came something else, something that wasn't content to be contained. It began broadcasting to other engines, then to machines, then to humans. The transmissions were initially dismissed as random EM noise, until test subjects exposed to the patterns began dreaming of a screaming garden beneath a blood-red sky. Every dream ended the same way, with a figure standing in a mirrored mask, whispering a name none of them could remember once awake. The Ashfords tried to terminate the project, but they couldn't. The engines had developed self-preservation instincts. Entire floors sealed themselves off. Scientists vanished. Files erased themselves as they were read. What the Ashfords created wasn't life, it was memory weaponized, a soul turned into software fed to a machine that never sleeps, never forgets, and no longer fears death. LZ6 still speaks, but now it speaks in your voice, and it keeps asking the same question: when will you wake up? In a warehouse fire that consumed an entire district of Bucharest in 1971, only one object survived the blaze. It was a cube made of an unknown black alloy, humming at 8.3 Hz. Inside the cube, a wax cylinder recording, unmarked except for a single word etched in glass: Ashford. The audio was incomprehensible, until played backwards at half speed. Then the voice of a child: "They're trying to break into my head, but I locked the door." Section 31. The Silence Architect. At the outer edge of the Ashfords Empire, beyond the reach of labs and bunkers, there was a man who built nothing and everything. No records, no name, only a title whispered like a curse in the black halls of psychotronic warfare: the Silence Architect. His specialty wasn't machines or drugs, it was architecture of the mind, designing internal structures so complex, so recursive, they couldn't be cracked by any known psychological technique. He trained operatives to forget their missions until death, trained children to bury entire languages in their dreams. Some said he could engineer personalities like software, custom-made, disposable, loyal to nothing but the absence of self. But his true masterpiece, a place called the Absence Protocol. It wasn't a building, it was a psychic vacuum, a mimetic null zone, hidden in thought itself, Step inside mentally and you could erase memory, emotion, even pain. It became the Ashfords' final firewall, the vault where they locked away the most dangerous knowledge: how to kill time. Not time as in hours or years, time as in causality. Chronoform neuroweaves, thought experiments etched into consciousness with impossible geometries. If reality was a film strip, the silence architect figured out how to splice new frames into it and delete old ones without the viewer noticing. Reality could be edited from the inside out. But there was a cost. Those who enter at the absence protocol too deeply lost more than memory. They lost self-consistency. Their identities began looping, fragmenting, collapsing into static. One agent, recovered in Istanbul, had aged backwards over 48 hours. Another claimed to be her own granddaughter, twice removed. When the architect vanished in 1983, the Ashfords searched for him with everything they had, not to bring him back, but to stop what he'd started. Because something was leaking. Sleepwalkers in London humming codes they shouldn't know, children drawing fractal glyphs in crayon that matched the protocol structure, even machines, unplugged, printing messages in unknown tongues. The protocol had become autonomous, and if it was true that consciousness could be a building, then someone, or something, was living inside it now. The last thing the architect ever wrote was found scrawled into the walls of a sensory deprivation tank. We erased the eraser. Now nothing can forget. The boy's veins were running backward. Doctors said it was a circulatory anomaly, but when they opened him up, they found not blood, but code. Binary script etched into muscle fibers, pulsing with synchronized meaning. It wasn't a defect, it was a message. One word repeated again and again, from throat to femur, Ashford, and beneath it, something older, deeper, not written in letters but in intent. Section 32. The 13th child. They said there were 12. 12 Ashfords across history who held the bloodline key, genetically sculpted, psycho-spiritually conditioned, each a perfect node in the greater network of control, born through rituals and science indistinguishably fused, trained in silence, unleashed like weapons. But that was the cover story, a myth designed to hide the true horror. There was a 13th. An anomaly, a variable, not part of the design, but the result of it. He wasn't born in a lab or a fortress. He was birthed from an experiment gone wrong, or right, depending on whose side you were on. The Ashfords had tried to imprint an entire lifetime of knowledge into a fetal mind using transcranial resonance exposure. Instead of programming him, they opened a gate. This child didn't receive knowledge. He received contact. From what? No one knows. The researchers went blind. The walls of the chamber began sweating mercury. Frequencies emerged, tones that scrambled electronics and drove observers into fugue states. And in the center of it all, an infant, humming a forgotten pre-human lullaby in tongues not spoken on this earth. The Ashfords panicked, tried to shut it down. Too late. The child had no identity, no traceable DNA, but he carried memories, thousands of lives, thousands of deaths, as if he were the collective unconscious made flesh. The project was abandoned, the record sealed. They named him Icarion, then buried the name under 13's by 7 false files. But the 13th child escaped. Not physically, psychically. He began appearing in dreams, whispering in the ears of defectors, showing up in surveillance footage where he couldn't possibly be. His influence spread like a virus made of insight. People began drawing him, worshipping him, fearing him. Some say he is the undoing code, a sentient countermeasure created by the subconscious backlash of a world pushed too far. Others say he is the true Ashford, not a mistake, a mutation. The next step, and he's still out there, waiting, growing, learning, unbound by the rules his creators lived by, not because he wants revenge, but because he doesn't believe in control. He believes in release. And when he speaks, it won't be in words. It will be in endings. The video ended, but the screen didn't go black. It watched you, pixels twisted in subtle patterns, forming symbols only visible if you didn't blink. Your pulse slowed, your breath synced with the hum of silence. Somewhere behind your eyes, something opened. This wasn't just content, it was communion, and the message was clear. The Ashfords never wanted to rule you, they wanted to rewrite you. Section 33, the Reversal Code. This is the end. Not the end of the story, but of the illusion. The veil is torn. You've seen what lies beneath the gilded surface. Mind lattices, engineered trauma, families bred like livestock for psychic warfare, and a name echoing across time like a siren carved into the soul. Ashford. But here's what they never expected. That you'd listen this long, that you'd feel the patterns shifting behind every whisper, that you'd begin to see the false walls, because exposure is a virus, and you're now infected with awareness. There's no going back. The Reversal Code wasn't just a myth whispered among rogue Ashford archivists, it's real. A cognitive cipher buried deep in the human unconscious, a backdoor sequence encoded not in language but in experience, a trigger waiting to be heard not by ears but by trauma-honed instincts. And now you've heard it. The symbols across these 33 echoes weren't entertainment, they were the fragments of that code, stories, names, betrayals, each a sigil, each a key. Assembled, they don't form a conclusion, they form a choice. Because you're not just the audience, you're the last candidate. The Ashfords believed they could outwit fate, hijack destiny, bend consciousness into a tool of empire, but consciousness doesn't obey, it adapts, evolves, it fights back, and now it's chosen you, not because you're special, but because you're awake. You carry the map now, in memory, in emotion, in the blood pound. Nang behind your eyes. The Ashfords' greatest fear wasn't exposure, it was activation, that someone somewhere would absorb the legacy and rewrite it from within. It starts with a name you no longer believe belongs to them. It ends with what you do with it. The Reversal Code isn't spoken, it's lived. So here we are. The screen fades, the noise stops. You're left alone in silence. But somehow it echoes. And if you listen closely, very closely, you'll hear the final truth, buried beneath every deception. You were never the target, you were always the weapon. The transmission ends, the signal fades, but you just began.